welcome everyone to Holding Space with Claire Bidwell Smith, Dr. Soo-Yeon Park, Reverend Dr. Carrie Jackson, the Reverend Linda Jaramillo, and Laura O'Loughlin. My name is Carrie Lang, and I'm the Operations Director at Reimagine. As a nonprofit organization, we spark community experiences like this one that empower individuals, families, and communities to face the hardest parts of our existence, including illness and death, while inspiring people to celebrate life and one another. Let's see if I can get these slides to go. All right, my screen does not want to work on the slides here. Hold on one moment. Well, we're going to go ahead and just change that situation. I want to thank our sponsors for today. Hang on one second. There we go. And our sponsors today are the John and Juana Harmon Foundation, Damani for Grief, the McElhoughton Foundation, Keeper, Interplay, and Fitting Tribute Funeral Services. And as you know, we are using Zoom today, so please note that we have a closed caption button at the bottom. If you click on the More button and you want to use the live transcript, you can use that. And we have you are able to chat, but if you would like to ask a question, you can raise your hand and we will call on you a little bit later. All right. So I want to acknowledge that we are all on the traditional lands of multitudes of Indigenous peoples, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. This land acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of colonialism. And I'm located on Muwekma, Ohlone, and Ramaytush land. If you're curious about the Indigenous territory where you're located, I'll post a link in the chat in just a moment. Now I'd like to introduce Claire Bidwell Smith, a grief therapist and author who will be your wonderful host for the event. Off to you, Claire.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Carrie. Hi, everybody. Welcome. I am really excited about today's Holding Space, and I'm excited to have four speakers here to talk with us. I'm not usually juggling four, but I think it's going to be fun and just more to talk about. So I'm excited to welcome the authors of Sisters in Mourning, Daughters Reflecting on Care, Loss, and Meaning. Welcome, ladies. I would love for you to start, whoever wants to start. We've got Carrie, or whoever wants to start. Tell us a little bit about the book and the kind of how and why it came to be.
Sure. I could begin, and thank you again for having us on this show. We're just grateful and delighted to be with you and to talk about the book and the process of putting the book together. Yeah. So this book began when my co-editor Michal Springer, who had been a friend and a colleague across the street. I work at Union Theological Seminary, and she at that time worked at Jewish Theological Seminary. And we've been collaborating on multiple projects. And her mother and my mother were both diagnosed with dementia and we've been caring for our mothers for a long time. And our mothers died 1 month of each other. And we were sharing our grief together, and she had sent me an email when I told her about my mother's passing. Her mother died a month before mine did. And she said, "We are sisters in mourning." And that began our journey. And so I was sharing that conversation with Laura's husband, Greg, who is also a colleague. And he says, "Well, you need to write that book with, women who are going through the same experience." So that's how the book concept was born. So we invited a few folks who we knew had traveled the journey of caring for their mothers and have now lost their mothers, and try to think about ways in which we keep things private. A lot of the grief can be private, and what would happen if we share that grief with one another? What would happen in that space? How can we help each other give birth to our own grief that we didn't even know we're grieving? I mean, there are obvious griefs, and then there are not so obvious grieving that we're doing. And we came together every other month. We talked about our stories. We wrote it out. And we shared, each of us took a turn each time we met to share our drafts of whatever we've written, however rough it may be. And some of us had a really hard time articulating what it is we wanted to say. Some of us were just, it was flowing out, like this is like an invitation. I think Carrie's was that way. Carrie's was always done on time, before time, and it was always flowing. And there are others, and Laura could speak for herself, that was just excruciatingly difficult. And we kind of, it was a process of holding a space where we come as whatever we can bring about where we were on the stage of grieving, with no judgment, and just sharing and gently urging each other onwards through our stories. I think sharing the stories themselves were a way to urge each other to think about our own grieving in perhaps slightly different ways, or nuanced ways, or ways in which we hadn't thought of. So, and from there we thought, okay, we need to put this into a book, and there it is. And the thing about this book is that we were trying to translate what we were doing in person. So other than most books have these chapters that are written and that's it. We actually have interruptions by each of the authors for each of the chapters. So in each of our chapters, we have our person who's leading the chapter in her story, and then each of the sisters would say something that would be prompted by a phrase or a word that one of the sisters had written, and we would write a little story or whatever we thought about. So it's a multiple conversation that's happening at the same time to kind of honor the kind of space we have created in person, to see how that might look like in print. So that's sort of the background of our book.
This is amazing. I wish everybody could have this experience when they're grieving. And I think some do in like a support group setting to a certain extent, but this sounds just so intentional and healing. How do you feel like it changed and shaped your grief for each of you? I'd love to hear from like each of you, what your personal experience of how it changed and shaped your grief.
I mean, I could start and just say a little bit, just to say for me, the book, there was an idea of a book from the beginning, but I didn't even think about that or care about that. I think for most of us, the point of it was to be in a process together. And what was also attractive, which I think maybe Sue had mentioned, is that we all had a strong spiritual practice of some sort or another. Mm-hmm. And that was, I think, one of the things that tied us together and helped support us in this process, in very different ways, coming from different religious backgrounds. So for me, from the get-go, there was a vulnerability and an intimacy. I didn't know anybody in the group at all. So it was a little daunting, and we only met in person once, the whole group. So everything was done online, which I think is what feels encouraging in terms of replication for others. But for me, I'll just say, and Claire, you share a little bit about your background, and I completely related to it because for me and also for another member who's not here of the group, Kathy, we had both lost our moms young, as you did, me at 20. And then subsequently, I had lost both of my sisters and then my father, both my sisters in their 40s and then my father. So the process of this particular group was completely transformed my relationship to my mother, who I said I had a kind of frozen grief for 40 years, because at the time in which she was dying, I was just in adolescence. And I didn't have any framework, and I was saying my chapter was on ritual. There was no capacity within my family to support the grief. There wasn't a communal ritual. Everybody was overwhelmed and devastated and traumatized. And so
I hear this so many times from adolescents who go through loss, that the families kind of don't have that kind of bandwidth to create those things.
Yeah. And then Motherless Daughters, which was a powerful book for me. I felt for the first time just a lot of powerful information that was in my body. And I'm a therapist, and I thought thought I did grieving well, and I didn't even realize I didn't until I entered into this group of women who, to me, were like surrogate, death doulas, helped me to move through that. And as Sue mentioned, it was excruciating for me. I could not find the words because I didn't have the words. It was all in my body, and it was all mixed together, and it wasn't sorted out. And in my chapter, what happened is I finally found a ritual to help me express myself. I decided to write letters to my mother, and I found some of her letters, and then I responded. And just being able to write her as a daughter opened up some channel for me, and I think tremendously with the support of this group and the encouragement, which I wanted to drop out a couple of times. I was like, I can't do it. And it was so I feel differently in my body, and as a being at 59 years of age, this was 40 years ago, I lost my mom. So there's, to me, the point that I would like to share with others is, especially for young people, it's never too late to be able to care for your grief, and to have it be held and supported, even if it's 40 years later. So
that's
just
amazing.
a little bit.
I always say that the grief kind of doesn't go anywhere. It's still there 40 years later if you want to dig into it. I love that you wrote those letters. That's something that I talk about a lot in my work, and I encourage clients to do, but I love that you found letters to respond to. And right when you said that, I just thought of like the last letters I have from my mom, which was from my freshman semester of college. And I was like, what would it be like to get those out and go back and respond to them? I write to her now about my life now, like my kids and my husband, but it would be interesting to go back and actually respond to her letters. That's beautiful.
Yeah, it's like having a conversation, right?
Yeah, that's amazing. Linda and Carrie, what about you guys? How was it transformative for you?
Well, I would have to say that first of all, I just feel so honored and blessed to be a part of this group. And it was really a wonderful experience, because I too came to the conversation with no intention of a book, right? It was just to tell story and share story. And a part of it for me was just this connection that we made to one another, because we have such different experiences and such different environments. And the two things I would lift up for me were that even more and more and more throughout the writing and the reflecting and all of that, the recognition that I had about how different the perspective of each of my siblings were to the situation, how we grieve differently. And there's 4 of us all together, and how we each had a different relationship with mom. And she, unlike some of my sisters here, she went quickly, and it was not a long time of comfort care of any sort. I mean, she fell, had an accident, and was gone within 3 weeks. So even at 91, we had not accepted, and I was in fierce denial during that time that she would actually die. And so that part of it was, this never going to happen. This is not true, and so forth. So just that following that grief, and I didn't live near my siblings, so I would fly in and be there. So there was all of that dynamic of who knew mom best, who was closest to her, and all those kind of things, and that the level of just sort of I would say the high level of conversation, high level being secret, and not completely candid, and how we each process through it. And I think it's still the case. She's been gone 10 years, so it's kind of one of those how we process through it. And I think that's the other part I want to share is the really amazing cultural expression that we shared. And because in community and Latino community and all of the things that we are and who we think, it was amazing to me that Mother's roots really came through and started our tree in ways that we could really branch into our different directions, but also stay close. And that level of understanding and recognition. And I'll remember the day when I was sharing. I remember it well, as everyone has shared. We were on Zoom most of the time, met once in person. But the day that it all came to me, because my chapter was to be about caring, coordinated care, right, with all your siblings. But then it really came down to how much we were keeping secrets. So when we named that, when I said, this is one of those nuances in Spanish is no digas nada, which don't talk about it. And so that's when everyone said, that's it. Name it that. And so that's when I sort of, wow, it came clear and true. And that's when I started to really appreciate each of our nuances and how as we are come from spiritual spaces, but how culturally diverse we are. And in the ways we interpret not only the spirit, but how we interpret community life and family life and the values and the core and all of that. So I think those were two things I would raise at this point of the richness and the connection. And we're not going to separate anytime soon.
I love that. I love the sibling piece. As a grief therapist, so much of what I hear from individual clients is how the family is grieving. And since I do a lot of parent loss, I hear a lot about the siblings, and it's incredible how different each sibling can grieve the same person and how all the dynamics change, and everybody has their role in the family to begin with. But then I always think about it like a table with multiple legs, and you take out one of the legs, the mom or the dad, and everyone else has to kind of like move around to keep the table standing. But it means people are getting into different uncomfortable roles sometimes. And it's fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Carrie, what about you?
So when my mom died, I was in my mid 50s. And I had the privilege of holding her in my arms, lying in the bed with her as she let go of her final breath. And so I was fine. I knew that I needed to take care of myself because I'd had 24 years since my father's death to my mother's death. And so I knew all of the things that I didn't do well the first time for my own self-care. So I was really intentional about practicing what I knew I would need. And yet, a couple of days after my mom died, my first words to my goddaughter were, "Who's going to call me baby girl now?"
Yeah.
And so my chapter really explores that. And it was very important for me for years. I wanted to tell my mother's story. And so being a part of this sacred project has given me an opportunity to tell my mom's story and to talk about how I was her baby girl, but then also how she became my baby girl. Yeah. And that has been so powerful for me to keep lifting up her life and her legacy and how who she was shaped so much of who I am. And I talk with my mother almost every day still. And I know how amazingly proud she is and delighted that she is that I've been telling her story. And so thank you so much, Claire, for today, for an opportunity that you're giving us to tell and to share these stories.
Absolutely. That's so beautiful. I'm always open about this. I think I cry myself to sleep at least once a year crying for my mama, and she's been gone for almost 25 years and I still like miss my mom. I miss being her baby girl, just like you. So that leads into another question I have. What does it mean to lose a mom? So why what's this mother-daughter relationship? Can you guys all speak on that a little bit? Sue, do you want to start?
Sure. That's kind of I think that's at the heart of my chapter, actually, interestingly, because my mother had Alzheimer's, which meant that whatever relationship we had as mother-daughter, and we had a very tight relationship, and we have, journeyed together in various shapes and forms and various tensions and ups and downs, and finally, as she came down with Alzheimer's and I was her primary caretaker, that role being reversed, like who is the mother, who's the daughter, right? And so my chapter is really exploring what is a mother-daughter relationship if you don't have memory to support that relationship. If there's no memory, if there isn't a shared memory of our life together, from whenever I started remembering having a mother, up to various different things that we did. And even when I would ask her, do you remember this? And she doesn't remember, or even reminding me how to cook certain foods that I'd forgotten and she could no longer remember, or knitting me something that she was so expertly knitted me all her life. And, she knitted this ridiculous thing that was all out of shape because she didn't know how to shape it right anymore. So we still have that as a memento. I think my sister didn't want to play. She and I were fighting over it. I think she has it somewhere. It looks a monstrous thing. I mean, I don't know. It's like totally out of shape. But if we don't have that, what does it mean to be in relationship? How do we begin new relationships? So I think for me, there is a deep mother-daughter bond. There is the womb bond. There is the relationship between her and me and my daughter. There's whole lot of that too. And how fragile that is. It could be gone with the loss of memory. And so I explore if she doesn't, am I a daughter if she's no longer my mother? And how the roles have been reversed. So I would I'll end there for others to talk about, but that's been my deep exploration is, so what does it mean to be a daughter?
Yeah.
What does it mean to have that relationship?
Yeah, the loss and grief that comes with a parent with memory loss is immense. And I feel like it's something so many people are going through, so I'm so glad that you are, talking about this and making space for it. It's a big one. Thank you. Yeah. Laura, we'll just keep going in this order again.
Sure. I was just thinking about that, and again, for me, so much of it has to, in terms of what does it mean to lose a mother, is related to the time in which I lost my mother and how significant it is in terms of framing all my relationships, and again, as a therapist and thinking about attachment, just recognizing that heightened sensitivity to loss, so the mother, what is a mother? It's like this archetypal sense of security, of nourishment, whether that's actually the case or not is much more complicated, but that sense of that yearning and wishing for a certain reflection of who you are and what you will become. And again, losing my mom early, I've lived, 30, 20 more years than she's ever lived. And so I think for me, I just noticed both this heightened sensitivity to loss, also this sense of mortality, that even as a teenager, all of my attachment relationships are framed around the potentiality of loss at all times, in ways that are overt or really subtle. Yes. and all the kind of interesting survival strategies around that, which could be a kind of a mother hunger or yearning, as well as perhaps sometimes also a distrust or a hyper independence, and and I think also, we talked a lot about this, our spiritual practices and how that influenced our caregiving and grieving. And for me, the loss of my mother young and then my sisters really just brought me to think about life and my orientation toward life in a way in which I think I was drawn to move towards towards a religious life that dealt with these existential issues as well as the psychological life, that really is focused on healing. And I think that's often the case. Our wounds are also our gifts and our orientation. And so I always want to kind of think about it in that way. And then the last thing I'll say, which is really interesting, is to look intergenerationally. So I only discovered during the pandemic, when we were doing this project, that my grandmother lost her mother from the pandemic of 1918.
Wow.
And I thought about how is her not having a mother, as a young woman affect the way she mothered my mother, and how does that affect how my mother showed up? So even before losing her, there were ways in which I could feel that wound or that kind of lack coming through. So there's kind of an intergenerational piece there of both, I think you could say, fragility and resilience around that. That's very particular to mothers. It's very particular to that lineage and the way we show up. So.
It's amazing. My guest last week was therapist Kelly McDaniel, who has a book coming out in June called Mother Hunger. Have you heard of this?
No, I haven't. No.
It's called Mother Hunger, which you just said, and it's coming out in June, and it's next month, and it's about all of that. It's about complicated relationships with mothers. It's about mothers that we lost to death, to abandonment, to mental illness, memory loss, and that mother hunger that ensues because of the attachment. She dives pretty deep into attachment theory, and it's a really kind of groundbreaking book. I'm very excited about it. But it's true. It's we also, when we talked last week, we talked about the intergenerational, traumas and wounds and healing that come down, which are amazing. Yeah. That's beautiful.
I'm excited to read it.
Yeah, keep an eye out for it.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, Linda?
Well, one of the things I started thinking about just now when we were talking about this and that whole relationship and intergenerational, it just reminds me, as Sue indicated earlier, that we actually interrupted each other's chapters really at the appropriate and right time, and sorted through that many times and looked at that together. But the thing that struck me about that was that I didn't even recognize and realize until I heard Laura and Kathy's stories about losing their mother at such a young age. And my mom lost her mom when she was 17. And really that sense of what that must have been like for her. And she was the eldest of the siblings.
Oh, yeah.
So she was thrown into the motherhood role at a very early age, 17, and really taking care of her younger sisters in ways that she had not prepared for, and how that must have affected her life as a mother to her siblings, but also a mother to her children later in life. And so that was, to me, one of those striking moments of acknowledgement and recognition of how that works and how intergenerations work. Because I come from a very large extended family, and my mom and her sisters were very tight and close to each other. And when they lost each other, it was really painful. And my aunt was the last one, but it was really painful for them, not only as mothers, but as sisters, and what that felt like, because I also have two sibling sisters, and how that affects, how we relate. But the thing I would say is that the one thing that's not yet done or needs to be discussed is how my brother is sensing the loss as a son, And the mother-daughter is a very special bond, I believe, because we sort of get it, But for my brother, we've not had that conversation in any level of intimacy that really helps us to understand. And let me just finish by saying, I'm the youngest of the family, the youngest of the siblings. And so I had many opportunities, both in my younger years, because I was the last one at home, to get to know mom by myself. And she and I lived alone, by ourselves. And then later in life, how we actually got back to that practice of, laying in bed together and talking story.
I love
And so,
that.
and that was just really, really special. And one of the things we dreamed about with this book, and miraculously happened, I call it spirit, but that we wanted it to be ready for Mother's Day. And sure enough, it was largely through Sue's tenacity of getting it done. But it was ready by Mother's Day, and we got copies by Mother's Day. And my daughter has a very, very, really loving, close relationship with my mom when, as her grandmother. And everybody knew Grandma Louie, but Kathy, my daughter, had a really close relationship. And I was able to gift her the book and urge her to write her own story.
Oh, wow.
About her grandmother.
Oh,
and how that might look to her. And I'd love to hear it, because she's one of the people that read my chapter a couple of times and asked me questions that were very provoking and really helpful. And so besides this group of seven sisters together, among the six of the sisters around this group, Kathy was that other person.
Wow.
Who had privy to my words.
Mhm.
So it's going to be interesting how we move forth as I'm the mother and she's the daughter.
One thing you touched on, which we would have to have a whole nother show about, though, is male grief, and how
Yes.
sons grieve and how men grieve. And it's, there's not enough space in our culture for it. They're not given the kind of permission women are to grieve and to be vulnerable and to open up and commune around that. And it is so important. There's so many books for women, for daughters, for, spouses, mothers, wives that are out there, but not enough for men. I am heartened that we have a president who knows grief and talks openly about it, a male figure who can really, represent that and give people permission, especially right now, like the whole world is grieving. But it's a big thing, so I'm glad you mentioned that. Thank you. Carrie, what about you? You were kind of the one that sparked what does it mean to mothers and daughters, baby girl, you were hers, she was yours. What does that mean?
Well, my mother had been orphaned by her mother.
Mm-hmm.
And so having family was very, very important for her. And she was learning how to be a mother because it had not been something modeled for her.
Yeah.
And she and my dad had 3 sons first. She knew how to be a mother to sons, and she was figuring out how to be a mother to a daughter, and had placed a lot of her own hurt and longings, et cetera, on me. And so for many, many years, my mother and I did not have a very intimate relationship, even though we both wanted it, but we didn't know how to form it. And finally, we found our way. And then several years later, dementia started presenting. And so I started losing my mother, similar to what Sue described for herself. I started losing my mom, and I was really quite pained by that because we had just found our way to one another.
Yeah.
And so there was also this, who's the mother, who's the daughter. I saw my mother in so many ways still wanting to be mother as she had understood it, but no longer having the capacity. And she would say, do you want me to prepare food for you? But we didn't trust her to cook anymore because she had had some incidents. I'll just say it that way. And so there were some very interesting dynamics in the losing before she physically died. It was so profound for me in my mother's years with dementia, a major gift that she gave me that continues now. And that is, she celebrated everything. And even when her food was pureed because she didn't know how to chew anymore, she said, "Oh, this is the best food I've ever had." And that for me is the lasting gift of my mother to me, is learning to live in gratitude no matter the circumstances. And so being without a mother for me has been, and Linda talked about some of the gender differences. My brothers then started looking to me to be their nurturer in the ways that our mom had been. And so we've had to do some adjustments. One brother, even though older than I am, started calling me big sis. Not mom, but big sis. And I was like, no, dude, we're not going there. And, and sometimes, they would call me because my voice is very similar to our mother's voice. And especially when I sing, my singing voice is very similar to hers. And so there's some things about mother loss that my brothers experienced that's different from what I experienced. And yet sometimes I'm able to look in the mirror and see some aspects of the contours of my mother's face in mine. And that's just fun and wonderful. And so it's many things for me.
Yeah.
And of course, that she was my second parent, that had a different aspect to the loss as well. And feeling like, oh, this might have been some aspect of what my mother felt like when she was orphaned as a little child. It's like, I don't have a parent.
Yeah.
And so it's so many dimensions to it.
Yeah, that goes back to that intergenerational idea of how this kind of shapes us as women, as mothers, as families, that's fascinating. I want to present one more question to the four of you. And then also anyone here with us, please feel free to put some questions or comments in the chat or raise your hand if you want to ask a question directly. But I really want to ask you, the last big thing I really want to ask you about is spirituality and grief. I've been a grief therapist for over a decade. I started in hospice, then in private practice, and I've really seen that it's almost a stage of grief. I've started to think of it as. I have a lot of clients who come in and they've never had a spiritual practice. They don't have a religious framework. They either weren't raised with anything or they've left whatever it was that they maybe had. And when they go through a big loss, like a parent, a spouse, a child, it's almost impossible to not begin to kind of take a new look and think, where are they now? Are we connected? Why? What is the meaning of all this? Why some people, why others? I mean, it's a whole journey that I think people go down when they're grieving. And some who have already a spiritual framework or religious framework have a different kind of path in their grief than those who have to kind of come at it fresh or from scratch in a way. I would love to hear all of your thoughts on spirituality and grief. I know that's a big question.
Yeah.
we're gonna have to go another hour, but no.
Yeah. I could share about how that has helped me to process what's been happening as I care for my mother. For me, I think the place and time that I most needed or leaned on my spiritual resources is the time that I was caring for my mother, because the Alzheimer's disease, it was over a period of decade in varying degrees of wellness. And one of the things that I had to continually do in terms of make meaning of what is happening to her, right? What is happening to her? And one of the practices that I continually tried to do was, as my mother was going deeper and deeper into Alzheimer's, and her world no longer resembled any reality that we see here in terms of where she was in her time zone, where she was in her space. All that was different. And it's not something that I could ask her to come into my world. I need to enter her world. So that to me became a spiritual practice of entering her world, which is, in a way, this is what spiritual practices do. Yeah. We suspend, in a way, what seems just what it is, into something perhaps different, perhaps something more mystical, or perhaps something unseen, or perhaps you're thinking about it a different way. So by entering into my mother's Alzheimer world, which means I am immersed in her timeline and where she was at that time, and talking to her as if I knew I was there too with her. That was the way I could connect with her. Otherwise, I will lose her, right? So I had no choice but to enter that world. The other piece that, as I reflected on it after my mother passed away, was that in Christian liturgical calendar, there's a Good Friday, and then there is Easter, and in between that there is Holy Saturday, which is, we talk about Saturday of waiting. It's a period of waiting, holy waiting. And I recognized that the 10 years that I was working and caring for my mother was in a place of that waiting space. And to know that I was not abandoned there, that the Spirit and God was with me, the love was there for me in that holding, waiting space. And that is how I was able to make meaning of that long 10 years of, it seems like a grind at times, a lot of losses, big losses, small losses over a period of time, ambiguous loss, complicated grief, all that, right? So that's how I was able to really lean into the resources that I have to be able to make sense of what was going on, to help me to show up every time to say, yes, I can enter my mother's world without losing myself. Because that fear is, if I really go there, am I going to lose my reality here? And what does that look like? So that's how I was able to resource the spirituality, and the faith that I have was able to resource the caring and the grieving afterwards.
That's incredible. I think that's so amazing to think about from a caregiving standpoint, you entering into her space as a practice. That's really profound. Yeah, thank you. Laura, what about you?
Just to add on to what Sue said, this as a Buddhist practitioner, for the last 25 years, the whole orientation in Buddhism is around impermanence. And so, when I began to practice there with this tradition, it was so normalized. I had seen this as almost some kind of anomaly or some kind of special tragedy. And, there was something deeply comforting about an impermanence and the idea of birth and death as the way of, and the way that life is. And theoretically, we can know that, but to know that in the body, and for me, there's so many practices in our tradition that are just oriented around not seeing impermanence as some temporary solidity where then there's a loss. It's like every single moment is this opening up to and this letting go. And to learn, as a person who had so much grief and so much of it traumatic, to learn over time with my nervous system, just slowly how to open up to the enormity of the feelings, the holding, the tension, and the letting go, and then seeing that and feeling that and experiencing that as then connecting me to life, right? To all the other losses, and so in a way, a refusal to grieve or shutting down made me realize I was shutting down to life. I was shutting down to taking responsibility for the pain of the world, right? That our grief, so in a way you could say the spiritual practice is for me, seeing grief as a way of life, as a way of actually being able to live and love well. And also to just, I hate to say it this way, not make a big deal out of it in a certain way, that is both very sacred and very precious and very important, and also just the way things are, and so there's that, and lots of rituals and lots of practices around that. So I feel as if we could offer the world, this capacity to just metabolize what's happening, right? We can see, the gratitude and some of the other beautiful things that arise out of grief.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the big lofty goal, right? Like, how do we normalize death? How do we normalize end of life? How do we help people just feel more comfortable in these spaces? It's not normalized right now. It is the anomaly, but it's not, so it's a very important, beautiful way to think about it. I'm glad that you're doing the work you're doing. Thank you. Linda?
I think what I'm going to do is compare the spiritual practice with religiosity a little bit. And because I was born and raised a Catholic, my mother was a very, very devoted Catholic. And so the church was very clear about ritual and very clear about liturgy and very clear about the processes and so forth and so on. And even the practice of confession and, you know, forgiveness and all of that. And just some of those religious practices were things that she was really clinging tightly to. And the unfortunate part is that my mom never really talked about death openly, even when she was dying. And one of the things that we were really regretting is that we never really talked about what she wanted, you know, how she wanted that to go. Yeah. And because it was one of those denial pieces, which is why I'm still in denial, but part of that was just simply, I think, part of maybe it was part of her losing her mother at such a young age. Maybe it was part of a religious practice. Later in life, when I actually decided that I would leave the church and go into ministry in a Protestant denomination, I think the part that came alive for me was I still cling to a lot of the old religious practice. However, when I was studying in seminary, one of the things that I found and discovered is the whole idea of spiritual colonization, and how not only was I colonized, or my people were colonized by just the ethnic realities and our histories of our own particular life and our generations, but we were colonized by spirit as well. And our own spiritual colonization really draw us to a place of how do we actually break out? Because a mestiza is somebody who's got the mix of native spiritual practice along with the religion. So that spiritual colonization breakout for me and the recovery from that was really a treasure that I got to actually practice spiritual life with my mom. And we talked a lot about it. And I talked to her about it. She was very intrigued by the whole idea, and really chatted with her about it. So that was one of those things that I'm grateful for, because that's when I really started to understand and realize that this isn't all there is, there's so much more, and there's so much more to life. And it's almost like I think we make God too small. And I think if we make God into a bigger God, and the bigger God of however we define the divine, is that so much more than we could even understand in our own human condition. So I think that's a part that gives me comfort. And then the gift of her parish priest, who really got it and talked about it and talked about life ever after. And how our belief in Christianity of life ever after, and that I believe is what helped in terms of the journeying on. Like Carrie, I was also very honored to be sitting with my mom, and all of us were sitting around her bed as she was taking her last breaths, and just allowing her to just give her the notion and help encourage her that it was okay, that it was okay to go, because that just didn't seem normal. And I think the normality of it and the reality of it helps me to actually, she comes back to me in dream all the time. And when I need it, I tell her. And I say, Mom, you got to come on back now, because I'm in real trouble here. And so It's really great to have some of those spiritual realities come back. And that's a part of my grieving and the healing that happens. And I'm just so grateful for it. I'm really so grateful for that expanded, if you will, spiritual practice that broke out of colonization.
Oh, that's amazing. I could talk. I want to talk to you for hours about spiritual colonization. I think that's fascinating and important. I feel like I see a lot of clients really go through wait, what was this whole thing that I have been confined around or in for so long, that a real questioning of things, in this place when they go through big grief, which I think is amazing. It's one of the I always say that I feel like grief can be very transformative when we allow it, when we allow ourselves to open up to these questions and these big moments and these abilities to really take stock of who we are, what we want life to be, what we believe in. There's a lot of opportunity in grief, I think, to explore those things. So thank you. Carrie?
Since I was a little girl, I have had very direct communication with people who are no longer physically in their bodies.
Mm.
And that expression of spirituality has informed my entire life.
Yeah.
And so when I say I talk with my mother, I don't mean just I'm thinking about her and say something. I have conversation with my mother. And many years ago, a woman I had known as I was growing up who had physically died, and here, that's the language I use, physically died, came to me and requested that I deliver a message to her daughter. And so I said, why are you coming to me? And you talk with her. And she said, she doesn't believe that she can hear me, so she hasn't been hearing me.
Mm-hmm.
And it is the case, unfortunately. Usually if I get a message from someone, they don't give me the daughter's telephone number and all those. So she didn't help me know how to connect with her daughter. I had to get people who are still in body and, find her daughter and do all of that. And so I delivered the message to her daughter. And her daughter said to me, lose my number, don't ever call me again. You can't talk with dead people. And, we're Christian. And so she said, that's against the Bible, that's of the devil, and, all of those kinds of things. And she said, my mother would never say that to me. The particularities of the message are important. The mother told me to tell her daughter that she knew that she was gay and that she loves her and that she will never leave her. And so the daughter said to me, my mother would never say that. I did not know what was going on in the family at the time, was that the daughter had come out to her father and he had said, you are no longer my daughter. I didn't even know those things were happening. And here it was, this mother with all of her love for her daughter was trying to send that message to her to say, I love you. I don't care what caca you're dealing with your dad. I'm here, I love you. And it was sad to me that she could not receive this message. Her mom was trying her hardest to get to her. And one of my brothers saw the daughter several months later, and she said, tell your sister I got it. And so spirituality, as Linda was noting, is not contained in religiosity. We can have our religious traditions and practices, and they can be life-giving. And there's another dimension of life-giving that is possible in spiritual connection, in the varieties of ways we might allow that in our lives. And I'm grateful that my spirituality has included an openness to being in conversation with those who are not physically alive, but whose spirits are very alive. It has guided me in so many ways in my life.
Yeah.
And has helped me in those moments when I have felt I couldn't go on. I have felt the presence of my ancestors. And last thing, I went to an ophthalmology appointment a few weeks, a month ago. And as I walked across the threshold of the door, I felt my mother's presence with me. And then the woman who was checking me in, when she said my name, I swear I heard my mother's voice saying my name. And then this woman said to me, somebody just whispered to me, here she is.
Oh,
There are spiritual dimensions available to us for our healing and our transformation and for our empowerment and for our intimacy and on and on and on that are here for our accessing.
mm. What an amazing end note. I want to talk to you guys for hours. There, you have such a wealth.
And you still have to meet the other three of us.
Do it. Let's do it. I wonder if any one of you could maybe say a couple of words to Pat's statement here in the comments. I lost my mom to mental illness when I was 8. She died when she was 82 due to decreased health and dementia. I was 60. I don't feel like I've processed it yet. From age 8 on, how can I get to a better place? I think it's never too late, like Laura and I were saying, to process grief. It's never too late to look into your spirituality or religion, open those doors up to sit with this. I think it requires help, someone to bear witness, as you have all done for each other, and to support each other. Do any of you have any closing words for how Pat and all of us can kind of continue to sit with these things?
Laura, do you want to jump in here?
I don't, I'm just, yeah, it's so individual in a way too. So it's kind of like what Carrie was saying. I think, we could always create rituals that we kind of know in our bodies, in our hearts, and our minds that something is needed. And it's almost like a sitting back and a listening and playing with, and trying something, but whether it's having a conversation, listening for our loved ones speaking to us, or writing a letter, or making an offering, or going out in nature. There's hundreds of different ways. And I do think, for me, having had, decades of spiritual practice, it shifted when I had community, and this community, because people do not talk about it, as you say, and they don't name it, and there's shame there and hiddenness, and if there's complicated relationships. So I think part of why we're doing this is hoping that people can have the courage and bravery to meet with others, even if it's 1 or 2 other people, and be able to speak this, because I think that helps to move it and shift it. So, I hope you can find something like that.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you to all of you, Carrie, Linda, and Sue. Where can people find the book? Where can people find you? Everywhere, anywhere online. Google
So
you.
the book is on Amazon. So you can find the book on Amazon. And I guess I could I'll put my email address in the chat.
Yeah.
And then you could find the rest through me. If you
Perfect.
need to reach any one of us, I'm happy to connect you to any of the 7 of us that has written the book together.
Yeah, thank you, Sue.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone who was here. Thank you to Reimagine for always holding space for this, these rich conversations. Oh my gosh, thank you guys so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for holding space.
Wow.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.